friends and members of the audience, thank you for coming this afternoon. I would like to jump straight to the inflection condition that Nick just discussed. The possibilities to diverge, to somehow not follow the trajectories imposed on us is most probably what we're trying to discuss here. The possibilities of understanding the relationships between our ambitions and what is imposed on us. Do we inhabit a prescribed trajectory with all its ebbs and flows and digressions already put in place by the conditions through which we somehow envision them, or is there any possibility of acting? Is there any possibility of organizing a digression, a setting aside? I would like to start by bringing up a condition of inhabitation of this kind of attitude, an attitude towards independence, which is the motto, nullius in verba, of the Royal Society. The Royal Society, from the outset, is set up against authority, against the possibilities of having to follow a master. Nothing needs to be taken by its word. You will have to challenge. You will have to constantly act in order to somehow make your actions resonate with an ambition never to be simply a slave of a master, but a guest. The ambition of the Royal Society, and nullius in verba, is the admonition to act in order to be guests everywhere. In order to be guests everywhere somehow is a difficult task in contemporary life, because it demands somehow not to follow trajectories, not to follow given trajectories. So how do you know where you're going? How do you know not to become hostage of a trajectory? How do you know how to set out notions of independence and interdependence? The conditions of the operations of science have, over the last 3 centuries, moved very quickly away from the notion of rejection of authority and approximated the conditions through which the production of facts that authority can rely upon are somehow given science, and in particular predictive sciences, the capacity of acquiring a lot of funds. Governments like people who can tell them what's going to happen, and this has created a sort of hostage situation of science towards authority. Authority is a very strange word. In order to act, one needs to have authority. That means you need to somehow carry the weight of your knowledge. And the knowledge is then, of course, powerful because it settles ambiguities, it settles digressions, it settles different opinions. To act is linked to the notion of an author, to someone who owns their own voice, rather than someone who speaks in the name of others. But it's also linked to the very weird notion of augmentation, to the notion of increasing activities, of increasing and bundling together different trajectories somehow through the organization of life as a technology. And the question that somehow we are investigating here is the possibility to think that technology is now our author. What we're seeing here is a fragment of the archives of the Anthropocene Observatory, a project developed together with the filmmaker and photographer Armin Link and the curator Anselm Franke and Territorial Agency. the possibilities of understanding the tipping point of climate change, the tipping point of the Anthropocene, as a complex negotiation between a prescribed future into our models and the possibility of acting on them, somehow need to take into consideration these inflections, these possibilities of digressions, and need, in our understanding, to address the bizarre, almost problematic situation of understanding that the current tipping point of the Anthropocene, leaving behind us the 11,000 years of written civilization, needs somehow to also address at the same time the fact that our understanding of change is a Holocene understanding of change. So once we leave back behind us in the deep abyss of time, the Anthropocene ends up being a condition of ambiguity. Are we simply going to be inscribed into the long trajectory of nature, or are we going to be inscribing ourselves on it? Is nature becoming more human? So the question that I am trying to put on the table here today is one of negotiations, one of understanding, rather than simply having to approximate overall and overarching trajectories and processes. One could start looking at the conditions through which the contemporary forms of political science and are always trying to understand the justifications for digressions of another digression. So what you're seeing is a set of constant jump between different forms of politics, where truth is always understood as absolute only on one side. The approximation of truth is rarely that asymptote, and that is then a shared trajectory. Somehow the contemporary politics, so aggressive, seems to us becoming an asymptote of multiple tipping points, of multiple digressions. And so the question here is one of understanding the logics of the other, the xenologics, the possibilities of being a guest everywhere entail somehow production of meaning from the two sides of that asymptote. Today, the conditions are very clear. We need to keep oil in the ground. The peak oil, that graph that was shown by Nick, is becoming more and more present in our minds as we live the long event of knowledge of climate change. And here you see the Conference of Parties in Warsaw, where the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the parties of the United Nations Framework of Convention on Climate Change gather to articulate those negotiations. So we need to keep oil in the ground, but oil is obviously such a powerful entity that it's almost impossible for us to think that we can keep oil in the ground. The conditions of approximation to that truth condition, that asymptotic condition of leaving oil in the ground, is addressing oil. And we'll start seeing here a project that we are developing, Territorial Agency, called the Museum of Oil. The event of knowledge that we ought to keep oil in the ground, at the same time, brings us to an understanding, to an inflection that we can't keep oil in the ground. Otherwise, we'll have to change everything in our life. Otherwise, we couldn't be here. We couldn't have electricity, we couldn't have transport systems. We would quickly regress to a Neolithic basis. Now we are almost 7.5 billion humans. We will very quickly regress to a few hundred million. So the question is here a particular one. It's a particular one because the knowledge that we're creating about the fact that we can't burn oil means also that we understand very well that we are stuck with it, that we are, in that sense, past the apocalypse. And we are ringing the bell and everybody's shouting, the house is on fire, but nobody's actually taking care because the apocalypse has already happened. We are after the revelation. And this is a particular situation of climate change politics, which is the form of politics that we inhabit today. And I think it comes as no surprise to anyone in the room that the current administration of the United States is an oil administration. It's a desperate attempt to inhabit that trajectory, that condition of the inflection. So we ought to keep oil in the ground, because if we don't, it will destroy our life. We can't keep oil in the ground because otherwise we have to change our life. And this is, I would consider, the tipping point of the Anthropocene. It's a tipping point that makes us stuck. It's a stasis. It's a condition of complete stillness. We are somehow completely blocked vis-à-vis the possibility of action. So in this condition, in this particular cut of the Anthropocene, we start seeing a possibility, a condition through which what Nick calls the inflective politics could start operating a different kind of negotiation and different kind of diplomacy. And the aims that the Museum of Oil sets out, and it's a project developed with our friends at Greenpeace, and here you see the first installment of the Museum of Oil at ZKM in Karlsruhe, next to Bruno Latour's exhibition Reset Modernity. The aims are very clear. We need to keep oil in the ground. In order to keep oil in the ground, we need to disentangle ourselves from its power. The most obvious condition of power of oil, it's its energetic condition. It burns very quickly. But it's also powerful because it infiltrates every single policy that we set out for ourselves. It is sitting at every table in a boardroom. It is in every prime ministerial office. It is powerful politically. So how do we understand, how do we approach this condition where power, our societal power, our political condition is blocking us? And the more we try to address it, the more distant, the more away it becomes. The proposition from our perspective is rather simple. We need to transform the Earth into a museum in order to conserve it, in order to maintain it and safeguard it and articulate the conditions to hold off its possible destruction. Exactly like you would do in an archaeological museum where you try to safeguard the erosion of a particular bone or a particular artifact. And this brings a very strange notion here in the foreground, to understand that the Anthropocene, on one side, is not simply man-made nature, but it's a particular condition through which we are transferring agency away from humans. From within, we think it's technology, hence we've done it. We could take care of it. Since we've done it, we can easily undo it. It's only up to our minds, our wills, and the tipping points are all to be conducted into morals and ethics. But it's exactly at that point that the motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, don't take anything for granted, nothing in words, brings us to understand that contemporary Anthropocene politics is more than ever a notion of registration, a notion of recording and registering both life, and at the same time as we are registering life as if it would be a fact in nature, we are registering our possibilities of disentangling us from that artifact. So what you see here is a number of attempts to link multiple views, both from complex remote sensing surveys of the planet, articulating precise territorial conditions where oil has infiltrated itself and made itself so pervasive, but at the same time so thin and fragile that it's become highly risky and untenable. So probably today, the question of the conditions, whether we can consider ourselves in one trajectory or not, has become whether there is any trajectory at all, or rather multiple concurrent trajectories constantly engaging with a situation. Is stasis an equilibrium, or is it an opposition of forces? And this is where the notion of a territory for us is interesting. Territory not in the sense of a land. In this particular case, you're seeing simultaneously a piece of Texas, the Russian Arctic, and behind there, the Middle Eastern peninsulas and the Red Sea. A territory is not simply land. It's the place from where we warn off people, where we scare people, where we deter people from grabbing what keeps us alive. So the idea is very straightforward, to link, like in this case, data from remote sensing technologies, in this situation from Landsat satellites circulating and orbiting above our planet, and from the ground, from NGOs, in order to illustrate the magic conditions through which we try to keep evil out. And those conditions of territorial magic, where we have to put up symbols and conditions of borders, of tipping points that you cannot trespass, I think are the most valid proposition that architecture has in its rucksack. The only thing that architects can actually do is this. It's not much that we can do as architects, but to put up boundaries and warning signs to stay out or to come in is what we maybe can do. And so what we're seeing here is the delineation of precise territories that are completely taken over by oil. In the case of the Canadian forest, completely transformed by even looking for oil, with thousands and thousands of kilometers of forest cut through by and plowed by trucks, only for the sounding of the earth, in order to inquire into the echo of the earth, in order to maybe understand there might be oil. So what we're trying to do is trying to bring to the foreground not the trajectory, but the multiple contradictory trajectories through which we understand that in order to maintain what keeps us alive, as in a museum, we need to start very carefully undoing the different trajectories that have now brought it in such a turbulent situation. And I'm very happy that I see here in the darkness some of the students, and I was having a conversation a few days ago with one of them about turbulence. Is turbulence, in that sense, a more complicated trajectory that engulfs us, that we inhabit? Is it one of multiple inflections? And this is one of the difficult questions that I think people are asking, especially of the newer generations, how to become sensitive to these turbulences. How do you become alert? How do you watch out in order to remain alive? So the conditions I think that Nick has set out here are at once those of thinking transformation, thinking how aesthetics makes us alert to a situation, and aesthetics also gathers and argues around a new forum those conditions that become more and more apparent, but it's also a very difficult engagement with not only becoming aware of where we're going, but knowing that we are stuck, that there's no way that we can go. If we look back at the work of the COP that we started with in these beautiful halls, both in Geneva and in Bonn and in Warsaw, the Paris agreements that have been reached seems really more than an apocalypse ago. Last year would entail 7 Earths. So, on one side, we all agree that we should keep oil in the ground, even though oil is never mentioned in those agreements, because it's so powerful. But if we want to keep it in the ground and we all go through those very complex meetings of negotiations, we end up having to have 7 Earths. There's only one. So we have to reset, as Bruno Latour would say. We have to reset and recalibrate our capacity of understanding what's going on. And this brings us into the sort of problematic condition of becoming more and more approximate to a constant measuring of our situation vis-à-vis its transformation. That brings us more and more close to the neoliberal conditions of self-measure, organization of life through constant monitoring. So we are in a situation where in order to get out of technology or the making of the Earth into a technological apparatus, we need more technology. We need more understanding of our lives as a technological effort. And this is the probably the paradox that I would almost like to end with. The conditions through which we need to negotiate today our life and our survival. And by our, I don't mean only the white middle-aged men in the West, but our survival on this one planet is entering a very difficult negotiation process. A negotiation where not simply we have to reach an agreement from different opinions on the same fact, but the different opinions are not only diverging in their understanding of facts, they are creating different realities, different conditions, different articulations of those realities. So today, to negotiate, more than just to enter a transformation, and this is really what I learned from Nick, today, to negotiate means to enter a fluctuation, a constant, ultra-rapid fluctuation, more than as a meandering through the difficulties of contemporary politics. What we are seeing is an ultra-rapid oscillation process. Somehow the outset of being a guest everywhere, an attempt to be never subjugated to someone's authority is becoming today a more and more difficult installment for contemporary life. This is a series of fragments from the Museum of Oil by Territorial Agency and the Anthropocene Observatory by my friend Armin and Anselm and ours. And I thank you very much for your attention.